Assistance Animals in Housing. My name is Jennifer Purrington. I'm an attorney with Disability Law Colorado. Disability Law Colorado is Colorado's protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities. Every state and territory in the U.S. must have a designated P&A. DLC was designated in 1977. We protect and promote the rights of individuals with disabilities through legal representation, advocacy, investigation, education, and legislative action. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the fair housing laws, the laws that protect people with disabilities. So one is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, or the FHA. There's also the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, but in general, we just call it the Fair Housing Act, or the FHA. There's also the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, which is also called CADA, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and then there are also some local laws and ordinances. Today, we're mostly going to be focusing on the Fair Housing Act and the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. And in general, the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act sort of mirrors the FHA. There are a few differences. So the fair housing laws apply to most housing and vacant land intended to be used for housing. So this means that most dwellings are going to be covered by the Fair Housing Act or the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. That means apartments, condos, assisted living facilities, nursing homes, HOAs, privately funded or subsidized housing. There are a few exclusions, but they are very rare. One is religious organizations, private clubs. Under the Fair Housing Act, it's a fourplex or fewer, and if the owner actually lives there, it may be excluded from the Fair Housing Act. Also under the Fair Housing Act, a single-family home, if no realtor or property manager was used to sort of advertise or rent that home, the person owns less than 3 homes. It's a little bit complicated, but it's a fairly rare exception. There's also some senior housing exceptions. And then the one exception under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act is when someone owns a home and they rent or lease, a room or a part of their home to somebody else. But the person that owns the home is still living there. So that's one of the only exclusions under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, or CADA. So if we know that the Fair Housing Act and the CADA apply to most dwellings, what constitutes discrimination? So some examples might be refusing to show, rent, lease, or sell, denying availability altogether, unequal terms, conditions, or privileges, different rents or security deposits, different rules for eviction or non-renewal, harassment, unequal maintenance services, higher interest rates or predatory terms, discriminatory advertising, blockbusting or redlining, which means generally making certain housing unavailable to certain protected classes of people, denying reasonable accommodations or modifications, or retaliation. Those could all constitute discrimination. So basically, if you're treating someone differently because of their race, religion, gender, disability, or other protected trait, you're likely discriminating against them. So today, although there are many different types of discrimination, we are going to be talking about animals and how they relate to people with disabilities in housing. So what I'm going to say up front is that the issue of service and assistance animals is a very complicated issue. We do trainings on this a lot. And even after doing 3-hour trainings, there are still people who are not completely clear on the law. And we understand. We understand this because depending on where you are, you have different rights related to your use of a service or assistance animal. So if you are on the bus, your rights are different than in housing, than in your employment, than in at the airport. And that is very confusing. So we understand. And I'm going to do my best to tell you how animals that are related to a person's disability, service animals, assistance animals, are protected in housing. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is that there are 4 different general classifications of animals. First, there are service animals, and we'll go over these in more detail, but I'll just give you the general overview. So service animals are individually trained to perform a task or service for an individual with a disability. Assistance animals, which usually means companion emotional support animals, ameliorate or help one or more symptoms of a person's disability, and they do not have to be trained. Then, other than service and assistance animals, there are therapy animals. So therapy animals actually provide a benefit to other people. So they don't provide a benefit specifically to the owner, but they visit people in hospitals, nursing homes. The owner has them trained so they behave well in those settings, and they provide therapy or comfort to other people. So they are not actually protected. They're much like pets because, again, the owner is not receiving the benefit, the animal is benefiting others, and that's a therapy animal. So that's why if you have an emotional support animal or a companion animal, don't call it a therapy animal because therapy animal actually means something different. And I know that can be confusing, but it's better if you have a companion animal or emotional support animal to call it that and not call it a therapy animal. And then the 4th category, so there's service animals, assistance animals, therapy animals, and pets. So pets are the catch-all for all other animals that do not qualify in those other categories. So those are the 4 categories, and let me get that into that a little bit more. So what is a service animal? So this is very important. And we're talking about Colorado here because this can be different in different states, but in Colorado, and technically federally, a service animal is a dog or a miniature horse. I'll say that again. A service animal is a dog or a miniature horse. There are no service cats. There are no service monkeys. In Colorado, there are no service snakes. A service animal is a dog or a miniature horse. Also, very importantly, a service animal has to be individually trained to perform a task or service for an individual with a disability. So it's important to know that they can be trained by the owner. They could also be trained by an outside agency, but they can also be trained by the owner. But they have to be individually trained to perform a task or service. So these animals do not require specific licensing or certifications. They don't have to wear a vest because, again, you can train your animal yourself. So if you trained your animal yourself, you wouldn't have a certificate for yourself. You wouldn't have licensing for yourself. So that's why it's not required because someone can actually train their own service animal. Service animals also in training are covered in Colorado. That's a state-by-state thing, but service animals in training are covered in Colorado. And also important to note, which most people know, do not pet service animals. They are working. They are providing that task or service for a person with a disability. So that is a service animal. And a lot of times we just call them service dogs because most likely it's going to be a dog. It could be a miniature horse. But service animals are dogs or miniature horses. I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay, so then what is an assistance animal? An assistance animal is usually what people call companion animals, emotional support animals. So the issue with this is it's not actually specifically defined in the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Fair Housing Act, the FHA. But Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD, guidance, and case law defines these animals as animals that ameliorate or help one or more symptoms of a person's disability. So they aren't trained to do anything specifically, but they help the person with the disability. And they are not allowed everywhere, but they are allowed in housing. So another important point is there's not a specific limit on the type of animal or even how many. However, it must be reasonable. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but reasonableness is the key here. There also could be some local ordinances that may play a role as far as breed or size restrictions or farm animals or no farm animals or whatever it might be. But there's no limit on the type of animal or even how many animals are allowed other than reasonableness. So let me give you an example of what an assistance animal is and what it can do. So some examples of assistance animals are a cat who encourages a person with depression to get up, eat, take her medication, leave the house. So the cat is not telling the person to do those things. However, someone with depression, it may be one of the hardest things in the morning is just to get out of bed. And a cat who's hungry is going to paw at your face and get you out of bed. So the cat is helping that person with severe depression get up in the morning, get their day started, and hopefully have a successful day. Now, the cat isn't trained to do that, but it's a cat, so that's what it does. So it's helping that person with a disability with their disability. Another example is a dog who sits on its owner's lap when the owner is experiencing severe anxiety. So the dog isn't necessarily noticing the anxiety or picking up on it or isn't trained to do that. But the owner, when they feel that anxiety, asks the dog to get in their lap. And because the dog is there, it makes the owner feel better. And that owner has, severe anxiety, they have a disability, and the presence of the dog makes the owner feel better. That is an example of an assistance animal. The animal isn't trained to do that, but its mere presence is what helps that person. Another example would be a dog that helps a young person with autism learn to relate to others. So if the person with autism, having the dog helps others approach that person, and then that person is then encouraged to relate to others, have conversations, develop relationships, that dog is assisting that person with a disability. The dog, it has this attraction to other people because it's a dog and dogs are adorable, but it isn't trained to do that. It's just the benefit of having the dog, and it's benefiting the person with a disability. So those are some examples of assistance animals. Again, they're not service animals, they're assistance animals, and they help ameliorate the symptoms or conditions of a person's disability. So assistance animals aren't required to have any specific training. They have to be well behaved in general, but they just have to help the person with the disability. Also, important to note, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, assistance animals are not bound by weight, size, or breed restrictions. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's just important to know they are not bound by weight, size, or breed restrictions. So one of the more confusing things, if you're not already confused about animals, is that in housing, assistance animals, the word assistance animals actually applies to service and assistance animals. They sort of put them in one category together, which can be very confusing. But the point is that in housing, service and assistance animals are treated the same. So out in the community, they are not treated the same. But in housing, they are. They are both allowed as long as, qualifications are met in housing. So a housing provider must allow a service or companion animal, emotional support animal, assistance animal for a tenant if they do not allow pets if the person has a disability, the person requests the animal as a reasonable accommodation, and the person can show that they need the animal to help with issues related to their disability. All of these things are likely going to require documentation, but those are the things that need to be shown. You have a disability, you request an accommodation, you show that you have a need for the animal. So companion animals, emotional support animals are different than service animals for sure, but in housing, they have very similar rights. And HUD, Housing and Urban Development, considers them both assistance animals, which again is very confusing. I'm sorry. So, an important thing, what can a landlord require from a tenant if they're requesting the use of an animal? So they can require proof of disability if it's not obvious. So if you use a wheelchair and you need the animal related to your use of that wheelchair, then they should not be asking you if you have a disability because your disability is obvious. However, many disabilities are not obvious, and therefore proof of disability is required, and that needs to be from a medical provider. Also, you need to have proof that the animal help with the person's disability. This could be from a medical provider or anyone in the know. So in the know is in quotes because that is how it is explained in the guidance. In the know means someone in your life who knows that this animal helps you with your disability. Now, it could be a family member, a friend, a peer support group leader, anyone who knows that the animal helps with your disability. We recommend that you try to choose someone who maybe has a little bit of separation from you because that makes them a little more objective. But technically, the only requirement is that the person be in the know. So first, you have to prove that you have a disability, and that needs to be from a medical provider, unless your disability is obvious. And then you need proof that the animal is helping the person with a disability, or a nexus, a connection between the animal and your disability. And that can come from a medical provider or, again, anyone in the know. You might also have to provide proof that the animal is registered and vaccinated, and that's more just from the county perspective. Any animal in the county may have to be registered and vaccinated. There's not an exclusion for service or assistance animals. The tenant has to take care of the animal. Just because it's a service or assistance animal does not mean that you do not have to pick up after your animal. You do. And if you cannot do it, you'll have to hire someone else to do it for you. The animal also cannot pose a real threat or significant nuisance. So that means it can't be an actual threat to anyone. It can't be biting at people or growling. And a significant nuisance, it can't be barking all the time. If it does those things, it can be asked to leave. Okay, so those are the things the landlord can ask you for. The landlord cannot ask you for an additional security deposit or pet rent, because an assistance animal and a service animal are not pets. They cannot require proof of training or certification, because assistance animals, companion and emotional support animals, are not necessarily trained. And a service animal can be trained by the owner. So there's actually no training or certification that they can ask for that would apply to everybody. Also, they can't ask for your full medical records. They can ask for that proof of disability, for that nexus between the animal and your disability, but they can't ask for your full medical records. And they also can't require the use of a form. A lot of landlords actually have a form for reasonable accommodations and maybe even specifically animals, and they can have that form because that might be helpful to you, but they can't require you to use it. So you might want to use it, and give it to your doctor and have it filled out. But if you don't want to use it and instead you want to provide a letter that provides the information that the landlord needs, then you can do that. So that's just important to know. So there are certain questions that we get many times about animals. So I'm going to try to cover those. One of them is, does the type of animal matter, the size or the breed? So generally we're talking about assistance animals here because at least a type of animal, because an assistance service animal is a dog or a miniature horse. But generally, the type of animal doesn't matter unless under like a city ordinance or something like that, the animal is considered poisonous or dangerous. Then it may not be allowed. And then again, breed bans don't apply to assistance animals or service animals, and neither do size restrictions. But especially breed bans, there are certain areas that ban pit bulls, and it's important to know that they can sometimes provide restrictions on service and assistance animals that are pit bulls if there's a breed ban against them, like maybe they need to require that they wear a muzzle, or they have to be on a leash or in a kennel or something like that. And those are allowed. It's kind of a complicated issue, but they can't out and out ban a certain breed of animal if it is a service or assistance animal. So if you have questions about that, I would recommend you contact our office and talk to us more specifically. But just so you know, there could be some restrictions on how the animal is used if there are breed bans, but they can't out and out ban a breed if it's a service animal or assistance animal. So another question is, what if someone wants more than one animal? So again, reasonableness is the key here. So if you feel that you need 2 emotional support animals, the best argument is that those animals provide different things to the person. If you have 2 cats and they both relieve your anxiety, it might not be reasonable to have both of them because they're not both providing you, a different assistance or help. But there are people who have service animals who also have emotional support animals. There are families who have multiple people with disabilities. So maybe a mother and a son both have an emotional support animal, or one has a service animal and one has an emotional support animal. So there can definitely be situations where people have more than one animal that is an emotional support animal or a service animal, and really reasonableness is just the question here. And that is part of your reasonable accommodation request. So it can get pretty complicated, but that's the more simple answer for it. Another thing that we hear a lot is, what about allergies? Because people have allergies to animals. So what I need to say first is that allergies don't necessarily qualify as disabilities unless that allergy is so severe that it could potentially, end your life. So allergies are often not considered disabilities unless they are severe. If someone with a severe allergy, is living in a complex, and someone who requires a service animal is in a complex, then the landlord has to be creative and needs to try to accommodate both people with disabilities. And I'm not saying that's easy, but there are ways that people have figured that out, as far as like maybe taking different elevators, spending, reserving certain spaces in common areas where, either people are allowed to be, scheduling issues, whatever it might be, so that both people with disabilities can hopefully be accommodated in that situation. But generally, just the sort of bothersome situation of allergies or the annoyance of allergies is not going to be something that's considered a disability. So some other questions are, must the tenant request a reasonable accommodation? So that's about, can someone else request it for them? Yes. Another family member or something like that could request the accommodation on behalf of a person with a disability. But ultimately, the documentation is going to have to come from that tenant about, their disability and their need. But the initial request and everything could come from someone else if that's necessary. And then another final question is the animal allowed in the gym, the pool area? This just sort of gets to like the common areas. And assistance animals, whether they're service animals, emotional support, companion animals, are allowed in common areas, but they're not allowed in the pool. They're not allowed to sort of be in the way of others trying to use that area, but they are allowed in those areas. Generally, being respectful of others. So another question is, does an assistance animal need to be certified? We hear this a lot. People go online and they certify their assistance animal. Legally, there is no certification out there that gives you any legal clout or any legal backup. Going online and paying $75 to say that your assistance animal is a companion animal is not going to mean anything legally. So we recommend that you not do things like that, because it's not going to help you legally. What's going to help you is talking to your doctor about your needs and your disability and getting that paperwork from them. If a landlord is requiring you to get some sort of certification, that's not correct. As we've talked about, there is no certification legally. So I don't know what they would be requiring of you, but they shouldn't be. One thing they can require, as we've talked about, is registration and vaccination, like with the county. And you might have to prove that to the landlord that you've done that. But again, these online certifications really don't mean anything legally. So a service animal might be trained by a, reputable organization, and maybe you have, documentation or proof of that. You don't have to provide that to anyone legally, but if you wanted to provide that to someone, you could. But these online things that ask you for some money and print out a certificate for you for your assistance animal are not legally valid. So another issue is damages. So a tenant cannot be required to pay additional maintenance or cleaning fees for an assistance animal. They can charge for damage if the landlord ordinarily charges for damages to the property. So they can't charge you extra ahead of time. They can't charge you a pet deposit because it's not a pet. But if the animal ruins the carpet and they would normally charge someone else for ruining the carpet, then they can charge you for ruining the carpet. And that would likely come out of your deposit. But just so you know, if the animal causes damage, you are responsible for that. So I know this is a complicated issue. You probably still have questions. Thankfully, there are some resources that might be helpful. There are 2 joint statements from HUD and the DOJ, or the Department of Justice. One is about reasonable accommodations, one is about reasonable modifications. And those are great documents that talk about all different types of accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities. So if you type in joint statement of HUD and DOJ reasonable accommodations, or joint statement of HUD and DOJ reasonable modifications in Google, those should show up first thing. They're great resources. There's also a document called HUD FHEO Notice 2020-01. So that's HUD FHEO Notice 2020-01. So it came out in January of 2020. And it's called Assessing a Person's Request to Have an Animal as a Reasonable Accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. That document is guidance from Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, about assistance animals. So that's also extremely helpful. I would also direct you to our website at Disability Law Colorado, which is www.disabilitylawco.org. We have a resources tab and fact sheets. We have a 20-page packet on animals. So that packet is going to include service and assistance animal, laws and legal information for employment in the community and housing and all different things. But it's a sort of comprehensive packet about the laws around service and assistance animals. I encourage you to go there. We have a lot of other fact sheets as well on animals and other things. So that's disabilitylawco.org. That could be a great place to find some resources. And then finally, I just want to let you know that if you feel that you have been discriminated against, then you can file a complaint about a housing issue. And specifically, we're talking about animals here, but it could be another housing issue related to discrimination with the Colorado Civil Rights Division, or CCRD. And that's within 1 year of the date of discrimination. Or you can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is HUD, HUD, within 1 year, again, of the date of discrimination. So if you type in Colorado Civil Rights Division or HUD into Google, you should find these, and you should find a link to file a complaint if you feel like you have been discriminated against. I hope this information was helpful. If you have further questions or have an issue you want Disability Law Colorado to consider, please go to our website at www.disabilitylawco.org. Call our phone number at 303-722-0300, or send us an email at dlcmail@disabilitylawco.org. Thank you.